We're here at the Westminster Reference Library next to a somewhat noisy building site to speak to Amelia Critchlow and Evy Jokhova about their collaborative show, Mimesis. Can you tell me about this show, Mimesis? Whose idea was it, and had you two worked together before?
We've not worked together before, but we knew each other and were involved in book fairs, and Mimesis was an idea that had been bubbling around for a while, and Evie and I started a conversation over a year ago, and we realised that both of our practices lent itself well to the concept. Would you agree?
It did. I think the concept of mimesis itself, it became apparent that that was our binding interest, or the binding interest between our practices a few months into the collaboration. But in terms of idea, it was actually Amelia's idea, who works a lot with books and looks at the ownership of knowledge, and Amelia found the space in the library. Mm-hmm. So in many ways the show and the collaboration was also bounded by the fact that we knew that the exhibition would take place this December at the library, so it's something we were working towards.
I'm particularly interested in working in spaces that move outside sort of White Cube Gallery, and there's more of a sort of intervention and a different commentary because of the context of a show. And so yes, I came to Evie and said I'd found this space, and we discussed the possibility of working together, and it just became an exciting possibility.
So there was no external curator, it's just the two of you?
It was the two of us, and a year-long dialogue to try to decipher in a space. How
did it work? I mean, did you both work separately in your own studios and then communicate in person or via email?
Initially we started off having a meeting. I remember it was at the South Bank, and then we discussed the idea of having a visual conversation where we literally started posting things back and forth, which is really exciting. So I sent Evie a magazine page, which is the basis of my practice. Evie sent something back, and then we met at your studio a couple of times.
We met a few making days.
Yeah, and a lot of conversations, even just walking down the street. I remember really long conversations walking around London. Evie's introduced me to a lot of buildings, a lot of places walking around London. It's been really interesting.
Can you explain a bit about the actual title, Mimesis, and how it relates to the work that you both produced?
Mimesis is about imitating and mimicry, and does come from Greece, and it's I think Plato coined the term, and a lot of my work looks at storytelling narratives and then images where they fit with that. And I personally find that I'm asking myself the question of who's putting the image first. Am I relating to that? Am I creating it? Is someone telling me what image I should aspire to, particularly in books and magazines? And I wanted to go back and work always with something that already exists, but it's a sort of imitation of what it is and what it could be, if that makes sense, and what would be my take on it, and how does that impact on social identity. And so mimesis really, it just was the right word and title to tie in with maybe a different layer, which is feelings and emotions and other things that you don't always see, hence the missing imagery in the book pages is whose story are we being told, what images, and who is the person behind them. A bit like the chicken and the egg, what comes first. In terms of my own practice, I am interested in storytelling and narrative, both from a visual point of view and a textual point of view. And the research for my MA was based around narrative and storytelling, where it all started. And the reason that I wanted to explore this was to look at where I myself fitted in to images and narratives that exist in popular culture. All my work is based, I guess, working with the detritus of popular culture, which is in the form here of book pages, over there magazine pages. And specifically for this, I wanted to look at a lot of my work's collaging on top, and I wanted to look at what happened when I removed completely, and did that leave space for me within the picture, because everything is edited and mediated, and that's the media. And I found, from a very personal point of view, where is my place in those stories that I'm being told or given. And working with Evie, I wanted, particularly knowing that she works with monumental scale and buildings, I wanted to look at how I could take something that's quite small and handheld and make it into something that's wall-based and more installation and structured. and then the shapes began to emerge through doing the actual install and the collaboration. But it's very much for me about untold stories, untold narratives, because essentially history is what's been recorded. And when you remove that, what is a different story that begins to come up? And working with Evy and looking at antiquity and where a lot of these images began, even in architecture, with the architecture with muses and women holding up buildings, and me beginning to look a little bit more into that, it fitted in terms of the scale. So these are all these are original magazine pages that I've then worked into erasing them with sandpaper. Yeah, that's my secret. My secret, sandpapering. And yeah, using the sandpaper in a way that lent itself to the shape, so that it's not, I guess it's not obvious, because people did ask me how I've done it, and some people quite clear, yeah, it's drawing.
Things that are mimicked are often mimicked in a decontextualized sense. There's certain things that date back to antiquity and often pre-antiquity that are still very present in our everyday. But of course we never reference them to that. It's sort of taken as is. We may put them into that sort of bracket of, oh, that's something from antiquity, but often they're completely misplaced. So you can find a 60s modernist building that was once social housing in Highgate with a caryatid column propping it up. Mm-hmm. So it's really taking things to a certain element of absurdity, which is why we're sitting on foam squishy stools that sort of rotate. But it was, I took the collaboration and fed my practice sort of through a route that was very material, because usually it's very research based. Mm-hmm. And here I just pushed it as far as I could in trying to use materials that mimic other things. So you have cement cubes, foam cubes, myself cutting a temple out of cheese that's imitating something else. But
which is the film.
Which is the film, and it's to scale actually, although I don't think I have a career in cheese sculpting. So a lot of my practice, it's shapeshifts, I guess would be the best way to say. I trained as a painter, but I very quickly realized that I had a problem with a square, and things were, well, never really fit in within one plane. So my painting started becoming drawings, expanding out of the square or the rectangular format. And it echoed, I guess, my research, which looks at people, social systems, and how these are formed by architecture. And, well, largely the politics of architecture, city planning, and also the forms of structures and how and where they're placed and how they define human movement, which then informs sort of the basis of society. I guess going all the way back to very primitive societies, to how classicism, and this is what actually the larger part of this piece references, how antiquity and classicism still influences Western society, and now parts of the influence are even seeping sort of beyond the Western, as the world in one way grows bigger but smaller. So this piece is two pieces in one way. It's Totem 3. I have a series of them in the studio, and they take different forms in different shows, and they stack. So all the elements are largely separate. So at the bottom is a linoleum flooring panel, which is a marble imitation. And I came across these by chance about 1.5 years ago, which was the first time in 8 years I returned to painting. So all my paintings subsequently are on these tiny A4 size linoleum flooring panel samples. And going forward here, it's a sort of a structure, and it works very well for the show because it was a Mimesis attempt at mimicking a console piece. So I wanted it to be a very formal piece of furniture. It's got 2 wheels but a cement cube, so it's futile and it can't really move anywhere. It's not wide enough and not quite tall enough to be a console either, so it's just there. And going forward, this bit, it's a lot of the work I do at the moment, having sort of moved on from the wall drawing and paintings that I've been making the past couple months. I've been working with different ways of mimicking stone, and the research also looks at our spiritual relationship to stone. So this is polystyrene, and it's very light, and it fools a lot of people because they come to the studio and they can no longer tell what's stone, what's cement, what's anything else apart from when I pick it up and I feel very strong tossing about giant stones. So that we've got the cement cube embedded back into that, and a piece which I've made specifically to hold the tablet. I guess it is an iPad holder of sorts, which is clay covered in stone effect paint, which is cheap spray paint that you get in DIY shops. It's become my go-to place. So that in itself is Totem 3, and then this is A House for a Mouse, which is displayed on Totem 3. And it's a film, it's an 8-minute film on a sort of do-it-yourself cutting a replica of a temple out of cheese. So I was in many ways lucky to be given 1,000 blocks of cheese because there was an accident in the factory, well, in the dairy, and they inoculated it accidentally with too much aging or maturing enzyme, so it didn't have the shelf life and matured twice as quick. So that's me in the background making my temple of cheese, and the drawing that's in the film is a 2-scale floor plan of the Greek goddess Nika's temple, and the goddess Nika is the goddess of hunting and gathering. So I chose her specifically because this is a house for a mouse, and a mouse hunts and gathers, so I thought she was the most appropriate goddess to represent the house for a mouse. The footage is cut with footage from Delos, which is an island that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an ancient sanctuary, and no one lives on the island. You can get a boat there from Mykonos. When the footage, it cuts back to the sanctuary and the temple's there, and this is also what the temple that I'm trying to make out of cheese is loosely based on. As much as anything else, it's both a very researched but also rather absurd and metaphorical piece. And the mouse doesn't ever make an appearance because it's like the gods. It's not a physical presence, it's sort of just there. And I spent about 4.5 hours cutting very smelly cheese. So I think it's also a mimicry of that sacrifice. Obviously not to the extent I wasn't lugging a marble pillar up a mountain, but I think 4 hours of cutting cheese might compare. Because there's so many works here that have a sequence of how they've triggered another work, and us mimicking each other or working in dialogue, and then some of the works are then re-mimicking some of the others, and it's pinpointing the starting points and also relaying this cohesively. So I think I'm re-mimicking the story now.
No, that's really interesting, because I sent you magazine page because I began to notice things like models were in certain contexts outside architecture that linked with the caryatids and the columns that Evy uses, and by sending those images back and forth I began to look at the context in which women are placed in magazines, which is a lot of my work. And you initially didn't notice the columns.
No,
in the
completely not.
Because we're looking at different things, and yet there's a really big crossover in terms of identity with buildings and imagery. That maybe I'm looking at that.
But that in itself was very interesting because I should have noticed the columns, and that is precisely why Amelia sent me the image.
Yeah.
But I potentially, because in many ways I'm aware of the architectural context that things are often placed in and how they try to sway imagery in terms of its contextualization. But I was so struck by the shape and the positioning of the body of the model, which looks exactly like one of the Graces in the British Museum, that I didn't notice anything else around me. For me, it just instantly I zoomed in on the body, on its positioning, and on the image that I had of one of the Graces from the British Museum that was pinned up on my wall at the time. So I made this painting in response to that, and it's part of a triptych. So she's the second Grace, the middle panel, which is slightly larger than the other two pieces. And the figure here is all that's left of her, so she's missing her head and largely her feet and whatever she was sat on. She's propped up on sticks in the British Museum, but what I've done here is kept the bits of her that are exposed in a sort of grey marble mimicry colour, but her robes I painted in this purplish tint, which mimics actually cardinals' robes. And historically, cardinal robes were painted with a pigment that was derived from mummy powder, and it is, quite frankly, as gross as it sounds, it's old ground up mummies that apparently, when mixed with oils and made into paint, produce this colour. So that was also my way of referencing back to the sort of the masculine clothing and the cardinal's clothing. And she's set in polystyrene. It's just something I've started working with about a year ago. And initially it was, as with many materials that I come across, as with the linoleum, which the totem pole was stood on. It's the same linoleum here, actually, which is the background. They're all forms of mimicry. And I came across a piece of polystyrene on the street, and it struck me just the similarity to marble. And this is reconstituted polystyrene, so the speckling is largely because they're mixing grey and white polystyrene, and it's a byproduct of recycling, but most polystyrene now comes in speckled form.
So you didn't put the grey in, it came like that?
It comes exactly like that, and a lot of the materials that I use, I try to keep as much of their essence revealed as possible. So here again, all the marbling, that's the original linoleum. And so it's always a mix of the original and processes that I put them through. So with the polystyrene, I do coat it in about 5 to 6 coats of gesso. So it seals the little gaps between the individual balls that form the polystyrene. If I don't do that, it's a lot more obvious that that's what it is. But with it sealed and nothing added in terms of paint, it really takes on this identity of being marble. I'm not sure it has any archival value, but the value of it, as with many of my works, is that I guess the sense that you get from being in the presence of the work. It's almost like building a stage set. So I don't mind most of the work being temporary. It's about the experience that the viewer has with it. And I think, well, this here is the same foam. You can actually squish it a little bit. It's modelled on sort of grander frames that you'd have in museums, but made out of packaging foam and attached around it, and fitting within the concept of also the collaboration with Amelia. It's pushing mimicry into every form, so I didn't feel it would make any sense to frame this. It had to be a fake frame that I constructed for the work, and then sits on all of Amelia's installation, which in a way also mimics a wallpaper. So sort of the layers that inform all the processes.
No, I definitely felt that I learnt a lot by working in close collaboration with one other person, which I haven't done before, and the fact that I felt that Evy's work looks at social identity from an architectural point of view was really interesting and revealing to me. I started looking at architecture completely differently, and then, funny enough, looking at the shapes that were created by removing the imagery from the book pages, which emulated some of Evy's work. But you begin to wonder whether that would have happened naturally, or you start to see these links. Did they come about through doing the collaboration? And someone did come and comment at the private view about the geometry of the shapes.
It looks architectural, that wall. It looks like you're looking at a block of flats and windows. To me.
Yeah, and it's interesting that where all these different layers and different connections come in that you might not have seen before, but when you work with someone whose practice is different and yet you see links, you find further links.
Definitely, because some of the mimicry was very conscious and some wasn't, and it's been really interesting now to reflect on it after that, because the flag that's here was a very conscious work that was mimicking Amelia's. So I asked Amelia to give me the dimensions of the cutout shapes that she's removing from the book pages that she's installed here, and I've scaled them up, but I kept the proportions. Okay. And instead of painting them onto the canvas, I chose specifically a raw linen canvas. I bleached them out, so the pattern's made with different dilutions of bleach, so you can see sort of the overlaying of them. And a few of the images are actually painted, but they're painted only with tinted gesso, which is a form of primer. So I consciously tried to paint as little as possible on it, so it mimics Amelia's act of removing, as well as pretty much copying her shapes at a different size.
And similarly, I knew that Evy did big painted wall things, and so I wanted to paint the wall there, and was specifically asking Evy what ties in, what goes well. And we knew the conversation would continue with the installation, because some of the stuff I had seen on photographs on Twitter but hadn't seen it in person, and so the very final bit of the conversation was how we worked everything together in the space, which was really interesting as well. It's a culmination of something that we've had going on for a year, but also it's the beginning of something else that's going to develop further because of all the links that are being made.
So you're going to carry on working together?
We haven't figured out where we're going to go next, but there's definitely like more to do. It feels
Absolutely.
like.
I mean, the conversation, I think, in many ways will probably continue perpetually.
Yeah.
Even if we're not in the same country, as we've realised, there is internet. And I can still post things to Amelia whether she wants them or not.